I'm Chris. I lead global brand strategy for the LEGO Group, and I've been asked to stand here in this Sir Peter Cook Design Pavilion and talk a little bit about LEGO Play. And it kind of occurs to me that's sort of like trying to explain jazz inside of a drum solo. I could do it, but I think it's better probably experienced rather than explained, and hopefully you guys will agree on that. Well, play is disappearing. It's disappearing from kids' lives. Public spaces are shrinking. It's probably easier to find a no ball game sign than it is to actually find a place for kids to play ball games. So the Play Pavilion is both a celebration, it's also a call to action. It's designed to be a joyful space that puts London's youth at the center, and a place for creativity, for community, for bringing families and people together.
We believe that Serpentine plus LEGO Group is clearly 1 + 1 = 11, and we are immensely excited that Peter accepted our invitation to design this first ever Play Pavilion. Now, we kind of thought, talking about play, it would be great to kind of begin with the beginning, to begin, Peter, with your childhood. And I've always been very fascinated that you actually already started to play with architecture, to play with cities when you were 10 years old as a child in Leicester. Can you tell us how it all began?
Well, I think there's a simple explanation, which is that my dad was in charge of taking buildings for the horses. And I used to go out as a little tiny tot and look at Italianate villas in the Midlands, where he'd say, we'll put 10 tanks there, or 3 platoons there. And I didn't know what it was about, but it must have gone into the system. The other thing is moving around a lot as a kid. And I used to go into hotels where you'd have these etchings in the lobby usually of, Stafford from the east, or Norwich from the north, or Leicester from the southwest. We always had these churches and castles and things. And I started to imitate them in school books as I got older. And then I wanted to make the link through to the next place that we lived in briefly, which was Norwich, because there's a very particular connection. My next manifestation in England would be a piece of the Norwich University of the Arts, where there will be a Peacock Wonder Room or hub, where I will invite, or they will invite on my behalf, all sorts of friends, some of whom are sitting here, to come and demonstrate that sort of experimental architecture is still alive and well, in fact increasing. And then between that and now we'll be in Taipei, in about 4 weeks' time, where I demonstrate that my drawings, such as the one you see on my shirt here, can be manifest. We actually make some pieces of large-scale elements, so that there's a connection between drawing, sort of things that you're selling or you see in the academy, right? And the tradition of experimental architecture, that in a way it's a soft sell of certain ideas which otherwise become rather arcane or rather complicated or treated as academic, if you state within the normal. Whereas if you make them agreeable as artworks, I think the business of agreeability is strongly linked to the idea of play. That you don't just say, I do this for this reason, this reason, this reason. I also then push the edges. That thing happens by reason or logic or, the accumulation of information, ideas. But then you try something that's a bit naughty. And it might fall off the edge, or it might lead to the next thing. Now, I've gone slightly off the history bit, but all these things link. I think there's no, in my view, academia, of which I've been part for a very long time, academia tends to separate, to say this is theory, this is logic, this is being sensible and good for the world, and that's art. And I can remember a conversation I now named after, Rome Koolhaas used to live at the top of our street, and Madeline still does, and we fell into talking about all the people we remembered at the AA, who'd been dismissed, including some people standing here, who'd been dismissed as artistes. And then we listed out the number of, including ourselves, of course, who'd started to build. And they'd done perfectly consumable buildings. They've done buildings that did not leak any more than anybody else's building, did not necessarily cost anything more than anybody else's building. And then we said, what do they say now? Because it was very convenient for us all to be sort of treated as wankers, artists, theoreticians, paper architects, they did in Russia. In fact, then we started building. And I think that this made the point that there should be no dividing line between the artist architect, the experimental object, the drawing, the prognostication, and the theory, and techniques. I mean, this thing uses, and I have to congratulate Tim and the boys in Yorkshire. I think they did amazing work. And when we went there, one realised that they're doing precision engineering. And although this looks like a sort of jolly bland piece of plastic, actually there's a lot of engineering inside this so that it can be reusable. Hopefully somebody already wants it somewhere. And I've seen what happens to some of the pavilions elsewhere, and it's really great that it's not just a sort of up there for a few weeks and then down, that it will go into some, whether it's San Diego or Zagreb, I don't know, or wherever.
It's key that it has a second
Or the
life,
North
yeah.
Pole, probably difficult in the North Pole, but it does have another life. And so I think all these things are connected. For me, until somebody gives me another big building to do, which I hope somebody in the room, or a small building to do, somebody in the room maybe, we're doing these exhibitions which still explore, they're never the same each time. This explores play in a certain colour palette and a certain context in amongst trees. Now, if you look at my drawings, the business of what would have been called a high-tech building or a technical building existing concurrently with trees, with natural vegetation, has interested me in a lot of the drawings where I put tectonic objects mysteriously appearing in the undergrowth, or some objects where you say, is that a growth? Is it a building? It sort of looks organised. What is it? I'm very interested in the edges. I was brought up as a functionist, and the sort of things that we were being shown and encouraged to do at the A or elsewhere were constructed objects. And I think in England, broadly speaking, we come from a stick and panel architecture. We're wood-based in origin. We tend to like steel structures rather than mass concrete structures, which is more a Mediterranean origin thing. I'm very interested in that, how sort of almost instinctive techniques move through even into advanced technology. There's still an instinct to make things with a stick, a column, and a panel. No longer necessarily wood, but maybe returning to wood, but steel and panel. You go south of the Alps, it becomes mass. It becomes keeping the sun out with big chunks of stone or concrete. And that sort of thing interests me. I don't think it's abstract. So all these things, I've gone way off the...
It all comes together in the pavilion. Now, before we talk about the Play Pavilion in more detail, one more question about the past, which is basically one of the reasons why we also were so excited that you accepted this invitation is, of course, that your work from the very beginning had play at its core. And you co-founded a movement, a legendary architecture group called Archigram. And in previous conversations, you told me that that was actually a reaction against a stagnant and uninspiring built environment which surrounded you. And you wanted to kind of do something which is more playful. And it began in a very DIY way, because it began with a magazine in 1961, which together with young architects you started. And then actually between 60 and 74, the group created over 900 drawings and really changed the architecture work. Can you talk a little bit about Archigram sort of from the perspective of play that you're here?
Well, yes, and also there was a sort of serious perspective, because when we were looking consciously at the history of avant-garde architecture groups, and particularly I was influenced by Peter Rainer Bannon, who happened to also live across the street. And I was very interested in the work that Bruno Taut did just after the First World War in Berlin, the glass chain and the magazine Fröhlich. Although I couldn't understand the German with the Fröhlich, nonetheless, I got the vibe that there was this group of people, each of them with a degree of individuality, but pushing. And the scene in London at that time was weird because there was a hell of a lot of building going on. It wasn't difficult to get a job. There's lots of building going on. Most of it not the sort of thing that we've been talking about for students. And if you bear in mind that, you know, Mike Webb being a student anyhow, David had been a student of Bucky Fuller at Nottingham. Mike Webb had been a student of James Sterling. I'd been a student of Peter Smith, and we've been taught by people who were, you know, highly discussable. And that's rather different from just learning it from books. We didn't want to do what they did, but we wanted to do something. And it was a kind of cri de coeur, because then I would say then as now, the general architectural scene in London was dour. There is, and I have to make this kind of statemental, but there is a stream of piety and Puritanism that runs through the English architectural scene that causes anything like this to be beyond the pale. Almost just because you're enjoying yourself, just because it's not all brown and grey, and you know, the worst possible thing. My pet hate is what is called the New London Vernacular, which is a sort of variant actually on Neo-Georgian. If you think about it, if you look at it, if you objectively look at it, and we all were brought up to sort of slide off Neo-Georgian, yet we're supposed to enjoy the London vernacular, which is, I think, an insult to the actual original Georgian. But I digress a little bit, except to say this is the scene against which we used to do drawings and projects. And Rob and I would draw something, and then we say, this will upset them. And we never said who the men were. We knew who the great unwashed were who would pass by the door, and they would predictably hate it. And we said, yes, we've broken through. And what was interesting was really our audience, the really passionately supportive audience, was existing in Japan and in Austria and in a slightly different way in Italy and the West Coast. I mean, these, particularly, I would say Austria, Japan and the West Coast were our natural allies, and where I still inclined towards. Why? It's a funny thing. I think the inventiveness of the Japanese, that they can be, you know, if you know a lot of Japanese people, they are complete nutcases. They're the most fall-about characters, and they love sort of silly gossip and robots and funny things that do funny. And you go down, even now when it's got a bit straight, if you go down the street in Tokyo, you see something that's been elegantly considered, and next to it a weird shit gadget that's poking up. It's all part of the same culture. And if you read texts of the most interesting Japanese architects, you find they have very complex minds. They don't think they're as nutty as the English. And I often make this analogy that you know, not only do they drive on the left-hand side and it's damp and narrow and so on, but they have the same sort of fall-about. They don't even need drink to do, although they do drink. But I think that's something which is not really talked about in serious architectural conversation, that you had a task. I mean, being brought up as a functionalist. Initially in Bournemouth, in the last school was teaching the École des Beaux-Arts curriculum, and that was weird. We were measuring ionic columns, we were tracing Gothic details with lead, and then drawing them. We were working our way through Victorian books of ornament, which was very, very opposite to what I was doing as a 14-year-old, which was reading, you know, Tolstoy and Cool. But it sort of helped in a curious backhanded way. I would never teach like that. But it was interesting to be almost a throwback. I'm so old now, but that stuff was coming in from like 1910 to us as students in the 50s, 60s. It was weird. But I think it feeds in. Also the business of living in many, many towns in the UK. gives you a built-in instinct for urbanism, meaning you have to, as a kid, you have to be pretty sharp to recognise, where's the chip shop, where's the model airplane shop, where's the bus, where's the dodgy street. And I think that's a sort of my comment I make to most students in crits is that, look, just take a look. How do we arrive here, how do we get into this place? What is it different if you approach it from Notting Hill Gate? Is it different if you approach it from Kensington High Street? Is it different if you're coming out from prom concert and seeing it lit up at night? And those things run through, which is another theme of mine. I'm trying to compress a lot of notions into 10 minutes, but is the idea of architectural theatre. I think every building, unless it's a sort of one loo hut, and even that, is a piece of theatre if you think about it. I behave, and knowing the dense toilet in the pavilion here, I behave slightly differently because of its physiognomy, because of its tightness, because we're coming into an art gallery rather than into airport loo. Even that, if you're sensitive, you do behave differently, and if you're a designer, you should design differently. Sorry, I've gone off the...
Incredibly telepathic, because it brings you right away to the next question, which was about that thing about theatre, because you wrote a beautiful text, actually, an architecture statement in January about the structure and about the Play Pavilion, and you say it's a piece of theatre. From a distance, intriguing shapes rise from within the structure, are third party obscured. Activities inside can be viewed through pierced and scooped walls, as if teasing come closer, there is more. A child might pop out on a slide, another may crawl through a hole on the ground, mystifying conventional entrance routes. Another mouse-shaped opening reveals a narrator, performer, or singer, entertaining eavesdroppers beyond. Now, from there you then go to the closer inspection. You say, upon closer inspection, the viewer will see the well-loved creative toy, LEGO, being integrated into the design with this continuous flow of lively shapes. And you describe the entire pavilion, we are sitting in here, the Play Pavilion, as a graphic toy. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea, the view from far, then zoom in, and then we encounter the Legos, and there is a flow of shapes?
Yes, I mean, historically, one has great problems because as a student, and a person of a certain generation, and it still obtains that we're still the children of modernism. And I can remember coming to London from the provinces and immediately going to all the white wall strip window things I could find with the photograph, being excited. I'm in London and there's some modern architecture at last. And that still sort of sits in the mind. On the other hand, most of the things that I find myself talking about and attracted to and responding with were done by the Victorians, actually. Not in the same exact figurative manner, but the instinct to say, we have a bridge. Okay, now the edges of the bridge stop you falling off the edge, but then we will decorate that, then we will enjoy. You take something like the Albert Bridge, wonderful object. It enjoyed the close space and the distance. I mean, I'm very interested in figurativeness, I think, which has gone through a period of being distasteful in architectural set. But no, you see something on the horizon, it either remains in the memory or it doesn't. And I think cities and urban design need certain figurative elements to fix them. It's terrible going to a city which appears to have nothing. Searching for something to cling on to. But then, as you come closer, the revelation, you see that patch, and it's sort of dark red or something. You realise as you get closer, it's not entirely red, it's made up of surfaces and distances. And I think the LEGO guys have done an amazing job with interpreting what were flat drawings, saying, if you can afford it, make it bulge out. And we had a fallback condition here, where we would have used paint if LEGO hadn't somehow dug in their pocket and brought out more LEGO. But they responded wonderfully, and these things are more exuberant than even I expected. The notion of the detail element, which is a focus. There's another sort of funny influence, I think, in this particular, since it's sitting here and which is the influence of Brazil, funny enough. That in amongst all this École de Beaux-Arts training in the early days before I went to there, I was fascinated by Brazil and somehow got hold of magazines with particularly Roberto Burle Marx, the landscape architect, as well as Niemeyer. And later I met these guys in their dotage, but what was fascinating is what you do with a natural phenomenon and then make a conscious figure. And some of this somehow feels to me Brazilian. I look at even the famous church of Niemeyer's, which I've not actually visited, I've seen some of the stuff. But this business of the lyrical line, and it's another. Sorry, I'm being very incoherent because I'm trying to think of all the things that are relevant.
But you're right away coming to the next question again. It's a perfect segue. You mentioned Niemeyer, who of course did one of the early Serpentine pavilions, and I remember visiting Niemeyer several times towards the very end of his life. He was 102 or 3 years old. He kept drawing. He was always drawing, and he would always draw on paper. And then the very last time I visited, he stopped drawing on paper and he drew in the air. The drawings became like air drawings. Now, ever since I've known you in the 90s, when we actually met you first 30 years ago doing research for Season Move, you've always been drawing. And I remember when we had the first meetings with the teams here at the Serpentine, evoking this idea of a collaboration with LEGO Group and the pavilion, the Play Pavilion, you immediately, in the very first meeting, produced amazing drawings. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of your work? Because you also realized extraordinary drawings related to this pavilion. For example, there is a drawing where all of a sudden many play pavilions almost form a landscape that will become a print. I think it's important to talk about drawings.
Yeah, drawing's a funny one because I was not a naturally good drawer. Even in the little classes down in Bournemouth, there were other people in the class who were better drawers than me. I can't do dogs and trees and bowls of fruit. I can't. I'm an architectural drawing that if I have an idea, I will find some damn way of drawing it. And there are people, Ron Arad, C.J. Lim, to name but 2 people sitting here, who can outdraw me at the drop of a hat. But and the other funny thing is, I don't do very many sketches. I did the Blue Building in Bournemouth with almost no sketches. I went straight from squared exercise book to a model, and then a colleague put it on the computer. So that when they wanted to publish my sketches for the local orchestra's brochure or something, I had to do them after the pretending that this is how I'd approach the thing, because people expect our architects to be sketches, particularly if they're sort of arty architects. Of course you do sketch. No, I don't. My sketches are awful. I use an expensive pen and just do diagrams. And they jump, and then these sorts of drawings, I start them, I have an idea for them, maybe a couple of pencil lines, and I start in the left-hand corner or in the middle or somewhere, and it grows. There is, of course, in my head some kind of program, but it's variation upon variation upon variation. Suddenly, 2/3 of it, oh, that's a good idea, let's try that as well. But people seem to call them, are they drawings or are they experiments? I don't know. I think I'm sort of suspicious. I mean, I think those schools of architecture that are still doing hand drawing in the first year, they absolutely should do, because it's a spontaneous response. The other thing is, of course, the hand drawing can get it wrong. You can draw anything. You can draw something that could not stand up or be, if it's in perspective, in the wrong place. Whereas the technological approach, on the end of the mouse, etc., tends to have to work correctly. If you give it an instruction, that instruction has to pertain. And then if you deviate, it's sort of something else. Whereas I can just go, oh, why not? Oh, why not? Why not? Even if there was another intention. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly well. And you mentioned schools, and that actually leads to a kind of a last set of questions I wanted to ask you, because obviously this is also about new generations, and it's about transmitting. And you've been teaching for so many decades, for 6 decades and more. But you've been talking a lot about the fact that actually some of the brightest designers are not interested in schools anymore. There isn't a John Haydock now. What's missing right now in schools, and how do you think, what kind of schools do we need? What's your advice in that regard?
I think more schools where the people teaching do stuff. I mean, I blame the Americans in particular for a tendency towards, people spending a lot of time reading philosophy, and then they go into some office where they're virtually a CAD monkey. And the really interesting aspects of architecture is just discovery and making and doing and trying and things. The best crits I've been on are probably ones where the teacher said, this thing should make smoke come out and crawl up the wall or something. Because you sit there and it doesn't work. And then you've buggered off to go to have some coffee or something, and they come running after it. It's working. That is the laboratory condition, which I think is marvelous and is sadly eroding. Even the 2 or 3 interesting schools in the world seem to be very cautious at best. Things mustn't go wrong because they'll get sued. Basically, and the American thing of people who teach pseudo but are actually, got there by doing PhDs of theory, really pisses me off. I mean, I blame them for it, and it's just taken on elsewhere.
But your studio is, of course, a lab where play happens, where experiment happens. So I thought it would be interesting if you could give maybe advice how we can keep the joy of playing live, and how you do that in your studio. Because whenever I visit your studio over the years, I feel that there is a great joy of playing in your studio. What's your advice? How can we keep that? How can we keep that up?
I think it's in the mind. I think that everybody's very afraid. They're afraid of being sued, being afraid of being thought, irrelevant, afraid of being thought not, conscious of the future of the world, etc. So it's all very grim. And then when you read history, you realise it's a bit like the Cromwellian period or something, or when you go in the cathedral in Lausanne, you're aware of this grimness. And then somebody says, yes, Calvin was here. You get it, you see it. It feeds through from the spirit of the place to the interpretation of the spirit. However clever the Gothic of that cathedral may or may not be.
Maybe a last question is the only recurrent question in our conversation, which is about the unrealized project. Now that the Play Pavilion is realized, can you tell us maybe about 1 or 2 of your favorite unrealized projects? And of course, the unrealized projects can be, too big to be realized. It can be lost competitions. It can be something that's too small to be realized. It can be too expensive. It can be too time intense. It can be a reason for it being unrealized. It can be forgotten projects, somewhere in a locker or in a file digitally. It can also be unrealized because of sensor. Or Doris Lessing here at the Serpentine many years ago said, there is also, the late Doris Lessing said, there is also projects which are unrealized because we don't dare to do them. So that's another reason why they're unrealized. So within this sort of broad spectrum, of the unrealized, looking at your practice of much more than 60 years, can you tell us about 1 or 2 of your favorite unrealized
projects? Well, I come at it from the other end because just over 20 years ago, we completed the Kunsthaus in Graz, the friendly alien stuff. And then people said, oh, if you can build that, other people, not just me, said, if you can build that, what about some of that other stuff that was dismissed as unbuildable? And so it's a long history. I mean, I think that conservative estimates, 60% of what I've drawn in some way could be built. Another 20% could have ideas that could feed into building. Then 20% of it is pie in the sky, if you like, using wonder materials that don't quite exist. But the connection, I come back to my earlier point, the connection between the experimental, the arty, the practical, the realizable, and even the economic is a continuous line. To answer your question directly, I mean, one thing comes straight into my mind. There's a project we did not so many years ago, competition for the music centre in Taipei, which is a string of these sorts of things. It doesn't quite look like this, but a string which started at the city end in a kind of distill rectilinear architecture and in bright colour. And as you moved along the third of a kilometre with the strip of these things, they metamorphose into the colour changing and eventually ending up just silver coloured, metal coloured. But extremely express, computer generated forms. And the idea was that as you moved along this strip, the architecture would metamorphose both colour-wise and form-wise. And then there was a sort of little stream and a walkway that sort of held it all together. That I would have liked to have built. I don't think they ever built it, but anyhow, I should be there shortly. Check out the site. Other things like that. And then the other thing is I've often designed towers. Now, I have had towers. Nobody has approached me for a tower, ever.
Towers like here.
Well, but rather, that you can
Bigger
go
ones.
inside, yeah. And I'm working on one now. But nobody commissions them. But I regard them as an important part. Even though I suffer from heights. Above the 6th floor, I get very nervous. But nonetheless, I enjoy designing towers. Whether they are kind of like obelisk, I think not. They usually have a quite distinct program of occupancy. The day hotel, but then part of it's for showrooms, and part of it's for dentist offices, and part of it's for car parking. I'm very conscious of the functional aspect. And one thing I will say, that even in archigram times, the funny thing that distinguished our drawings from, say, French experimental groups or Italian experimental groups was that we put the handrails in, and the toilets were the right size, and the escalators were 35 degrees with a 2-metre overrun, because you do. Because we were brought up as proper architects. And I have to keep reinforcing that point, that this is a functional object. I wanted actually the wall originally to be more waving around. And that would have cost more money, because then the dome would have had to be bigger. There would have been, quote unquote, wasted space. And in a way, intellectually, I'm not sure whether the wall should hug the dome. Conceptually, the dome should be a protector, and the walls an evocative space. So what you do then is, having been, for economic reasons, forced into the wall having to hug the diagram, is then to start to invade the space. And these columns, which of course are not the supporting columns, there are 4 places around, if you look carefully, which are actually where there's a supporting column in the system. So already it's not a modernist structure, because theoretically these should be the supports, but no, there's something else. These are the theatrical elements. And I think I look at I'm essentially a Gothic architect rather than a classical architect. And I look back at what the cathedral builders did, and they did all sorts of tricks of the trade. Sort of light sources that you can't see, hidden structures of domes and spires that are actually behind the thing that you do see. So that the tracery is often a drape, virtually interior design. And I'm fascinated by, on the one hand, knowing about these sort of generic theoretical issues, and then deciding when to drop the worry. There's always a thing I think as a teacher, I can sort of just end with teaching me. I've been struck by how many of my best students are potentially brilliant designers, or are brilliant designers. And then they do a competition, but because of the intellectual pressure placed upon them by some of the teachers, they start having art worry. They get 2/3 of the way down the competition and say, should we be doing this? And they run through all the arguments why you shouldn't. And end up screwing up the project. Whereas I always have a cut-off. I always say, bugger it, let's go for it. And the earlier you do that, the more, I think, the better the scheme. If you say, bugger it, let's go for it in the first 2 weeks, and you've still got a month to go, you have a chance.
That couldn't be a better conclusion. You described so beautifully how we can experience, this dome and the scooped walls with all these access, and exit points. So I think it's now the moment to experience the slides, the entry and exit points, to see the pavilions from all these different perspectives. And so grateful to you, Peter. Please give
Can I just also give a big thank you to the team at the Serpentine. They're lovely to work with. There's lots of them doing funny things. I'm never quite sure what they all do, but it's a wonderful team, and particularly the lady who lives in Wales. I blanked on her name.
What's her name?
Julie
Bonnell, who has built 18 pavilions.
It's stuck between Julie on the one hand and Tim on the other hand. It's like you've got to be on the case, and I love that. I love sort of heavy old professionals who don't mince words. They say, can't do that, too expensive. No, I wanted to do an inflatable mushroom. You remember that? And I still think that would be an amazing scheme. No. Wind, climate. Had a lot of trouble with the Omar one, and can't do it. Okay, can't do it. Okay, what can we do? And then you move on.
You're totally right. We should give a big round of applause to Peter and the dream team who made it all possible.
For the book, which Penny Publishing, and thank you, where is it gone, will be coming out, I think, early next year, which will have some of these same drawings, and the last section of it will be about this pavilion. So, buy the book.
Another big round of applause for Peter Cook.